Welcome, dear listener, to a journey through time where the gaslight flickers against velvet curtains and the rustle of silk mask secrets that history has kept hidden in the shadows. Tonight, we drift back to America in the 1880s, an era that glimmers in our collective memory like polished brass and crystal chandeliers, where elegance seemed to flow as naturally as champagne at a society gathering. But beneath those layers of lace and luxury, beneath the carefully constructed facade of refinement, lies a truth far more complex and fascinating than the gilded surface would suggest. So settle in, let your breathing slow, and allow yourself to be carried away into a world where appearances deceived even those who lived within them, where the very notion of cleanliness held meanings we can barely comprehend today. Picture, if you will, the America of the 1880s, a nation caught between two worlds, where the old ways of frontier living still whispered through the corridors of newly built mansions, where industrial wealth created palaces that rivaled European grandeur. Yet the most basic understanding of health and hygiene remained shrouded in fear, superstition, and dangerous misconceptions. The Gilded Age, as it would come to be known, painted itself in broad strokes of prosperity and progress. But like all gold leaf, it was merely a thin veneer over something far more tarnished and complex beneath in the drawing rooms of Fifth Avenue mansions and the parlors of modest middle-class homes alike. Women moved through their days in an elaborate dance of appearances, their lives choreographed by social expectations that demanded perfection in presentation while remaining willfully ignorant of the course such perfection extracted from their bodies, their health, and their very souls. These women, our grandmothers and great-grandmothers, existed in a world where the fear of water ran deeper than rivers, where the touch of soap upon skin was considered dangerous, where cleanliness itself was redefined through the alchemy of powders, perfumes, and prayers that reality might never pierce the carefully constructed illusion they wore like armor. The whole streets outside their windows buzzed with the energy of a nation transforming itself, where horse-drawn carriages shared cobblestones with the first experimental automobiles, where electric lights began to chase away the gas lamps that had illuminated the previous generation, where the very air seemed charged with possibility and change. Yet within the confines of their homes, these women remained trapped in practices that belonged to centuries past, bound by beliefs about their bodies that would seem not merely outdated, but actively harmful to our modern understanding. This was an America where a lady's virtue was measured not by her actual cleanliness but by her ability to appear clean, where the art of concealment had been elevated to such heights that even the women themselves began to believe their own performances. They lived in a world where the most intimate aspects of personal care were governed by rules that had nothing to do with health and everything to do with maintaining an image that society demanded they present, regardless of the personal cost. As we journey together through these hidden chapters of American womanhood, we will discover how fear shaped daily routines, how ignorance masqueraded as wisdom, how the pursuit of beauty became a dance with danger that these women performed with grace and determination, never fully understanding the price they paid. We will walk through their days from the moment they awakened in beds they shared with others, through their morning rituals that avoided water like a plague, through their careful application of cosmetics that promise beauty while delivering poison, to their evening preparations for sleep that were as elaborate as they were ineffective. The story we are about to unfold together is not one of judgment, but of understanding, not one of mockery, but of compassion for women who lived within the constraints of their time, who made choices based on the limited knowledge available to them, who found ways to survive and even thrive within systems that were designed more to control than to protect them. These were women of intelligence and resourcefulness, who adapted to impossible circumstances with creativity and grace, even as those very adaptations sometimes led them further from the health and happiness they sought. So close your eyes now, dear listener, and let yourself drift back through the decades. Past the world wars and social revolutions. Past the invention of modern medicine and the discovery of germs. Back to a time when mystery still cloaked the most basic functions of the human body. When science was still young and superstition still held sway over the most educated minds. Let yourself sink into the cushions of a Victorian parlor, surrounded by the scent of rosewater and talcum powder, the sound of rustling silk and whispered conversations, and prepare to discover the hidden world of American women in the 1880s, where nothing was quite as it seemed, and elegance came at a price that few were willing to acknowledge. The gaslight flickers. The curtains stir with an evening breeze that carries the scent of Horace and coal smoke. And our story begins in earnest, unfolding like the layers of a woman's dress. Each revelation bringing us closer to understanding the complex, contradictory, and utterly human world of hygiene in America's most gilded age. In this America of silk and secrets, where every surface gleamed with polish and every woman glided through her days as if floating on air, there existed a paradox so profound that it shaped not only daily life, but the very understanding of what it meant to be clean, healthy, and respectable. For in this world of supposed refinement, water itself had become the enemy, feared and avoided with the same fervor that modern society reserves for the most dangerous toxins. The women of the 1880s had inherited from their mothers and grandmothers a deep, abiding terror of water that went far beyond simple preference or convenience. This fear had roots that stretched back through generations of folk wisdom and medical misconceptions, creating a belief system so entrenched that it influenced every aspect of daily life. From the clothes they wore to the homes they designed. From the routines they followed to the very way they understood their own bodies. Water, they believed with the certainty of the devout, was a carrier of disease, a weakener of the constitution, a dangerous substance that could penetrate the skin and corrupt the delicate balance of humors that kept them alive and well. The medical authorities of the day, those learned men in their dark suits and serious expressions, reinforced these fears with theories that sound fantastical to our modern ears, but carried the weight of scientific authority in their time. They spoke of water as something that could open the pores too wide, allowing disease to enter, that could weaken the natural protective oils of the skin, that could disturb the body's careful equilibrium in ways that might take months or even years to restore. And so, in response to these fears, an entire system of bodily maintenance evolved that avoided water almost entirely, replacing the simple act of washing with elaborate rituals that involved powders and oils, brushes and cloths, perfumes and pomades, all designed to create the appearance and sensation of cleanliness without ever allowing water to touch the skin for more than the briefest of moments. The morning ritual of a respectable woman in 1880s America began not with the splash of water in a basin, but with the careful application of dry powders that promised to absorb the oils and odors that had accumulated during the night. These powders, made from everything from rice flour to crushed pearls, from cornstarch to finely ground orris root, were dusted across the skin with soft brushes made of badger hair or fine horsehair, each stroke designed to lift away the evidence of human biology while leaving behind a coating that would protect and perfume the skin throughout the day. The face, that most visible and important canvas of feminine presentation, received the most careful attention in this waterless cleansing routine. Instead of soap and water, women relied on cold creams made from animal fats and floral extracts, substances that could be applied and then wiped away with soft cloths, taking with them the dust and oils of the previous day while leaving behind a smooth, protected surface ready for the application of cosmetics. These creams, often made at home according to recipes passed down through families or purchased from apothecaries who promised miraculous results, contained ingredients that ranged from the benign to the actively dangerous. Yet they were applied with the faith of those who had few alternatives. The hair, perhaps even more than the face, revealed the extent to which water avoidance shaped daily life. For a woman's crowning glory was maintained through a complex system of brushing, powdering, and perfuming that could go weeks or even months without the intervention of water. The daily hair routine began with the careful removal of the previous day's pomades and powders through vigorous brushing with brushes that had been cleaned and perfumed overnight, followed by the application of fresh powders designed to absorb oils and provide a foundation for the elaborate styles that fashion demanded. These hair powders, often tinted to match or enhance the natural color of the hair, were made from a variety of substances that promised not only cleanliness but health and beauty as well. Rice powder provided a light, silky texture, while powdered orris root added a violet-like fragrance that could last throughout the day. More exotic ingredients, imported at great expense from Europe and Asia, promised even greater benefits. Powdered sandalwood for its supposedly strengthening properties, finely ground pearls for their lustrous qualities, even powders made from ground gemstones that were believed to impart their properties to the hair of those wealthy enough to afford them. The process of applying these powders was itself a ritual that could take hours, particularly for women of means who had the leisure to dedicate themselves fully to their appearance. The hair would be brushed section by section, each strand receiving individual attention, before the powders were applied with the same methodical care, worked through the hair with fingers and combs until every strand was coated and perfumed. The result was hair that appeared clean and lustrous, that smelled of flowers and spices, that moved and caught the light in ways that suggested health and vitality, yet had not been touched by water for weeks at a time. But the avoidance of water extended far beyond the daily routines of personal grooming, shaping even the most intimate aspects of bodily care in ways that modern sensibilities find difficult to comprehend. The monthly cycles that all women experienced were managed through systems that relied entirely on absorbent materials and frequent changes of undergarments rather than any form of washing, creating challenges that required both resourcefulness and an acceptance of odors and discomforts that were simply considered part of the feminine experience. The undergarments themselves, those layers of cotton and linen that formed the foundation of every woman's daily dress, were rarely washed in the sense that we understand the term, but rather were aired, brushed, and perfumed in the hope that these measures would suffice to maintain some semblance of freshness. The chemises and drawers that lay closest to the skin bore the brunt of bodily functions and secretions. Yet they might be worn for days or even weeks before being subjected to the dangerous process of actual washing, a procedure that was believed to weaken the fibers and reduce the lifespan of expensive garments. Instead, these intimate garments were subjected to what was euphemistically called refreshing, a process that involved hanging them in fresh air, brushing them with scented powders, and storing them with sachets of lavender or rose petals that would impart their fragrance to the fabric. The result was clothing that might appear fresh and smell pleasant to the casual observer, yet carried within its fibers the accumulated evidence of weeks of wear, a biological history that no amount of powder or perfume could entirely erase. The fear of water that governed these practices was not merely superstition, but was reinforced by observable consequences that seemed to confirm the wisdom of avoidance. Women who did venture to bathe more frequently often suffered from skin conditions that their water-avoiding sisters managed to escape, not because water was inherently harmful, but because the water available to them was often contaminated with bacteria and chemicals that made it genuinely dangerous. The soap available to them was harsh and alkaline, stripping away not only dirt but the natural oils that protected their skin, leaving them vulnerable to rashes, infections, and other ailments that seemed to prove the dangers of excessive cleanliness. Moreover, the homes in which they lived were often poorly heated, and the process of bathing in cold or barely warm water, followed by the long time required for hair to dry naturally, created genuine risks of illness that reinforced the wisdom of avoiding such practices. A woman who caught pneumonia after a bath would become a cautionary tale that reinforced the fears of her friends and neighbors, creating a cycle of confirmation that kept these practices firmly entrenched in daily life. The clothing worn by women of this era further reinforced the logic of dry cleaning methods. For the elaborate constructions of silk and velvet, wool and cotton that made up a fashionable wardrobe were often impossible to wash without destroying their shape, color, or texture. The investment represented by these garments was so significant that their preservation took precedence over any consideration of hygiene, leading to practices of spot cleaning, brushing, and airing that could maintain the appearance of freshness while never subjecting the fabric to the dangers of soap and water. The corsets that shaped every woman's silhouette presented particular challenges in this system of waterless maintenance. For these rigid constructions of whalebone and steel, covered in silk or cotton and worn directly against the skin, absorbed sweat and odors in ways that made them particularly challenging to keep fresh. Yet the cost and complexity of these garments meant that they might be worn for months at a time with only the most minimal attempts at cleaning, relying instead on frequent changes of the chemises worn beneath them and regular applications of perfumed powders to mask any unpleasant odors that might develop. The daily routines that evolved around these constraints were elaborate performances that required both skill and dedication, turning the simple act of getting dressed into a complex ritual that could consume hours of each day. Women learned to manipulate powders and perfumes with the precision of artists, to layer their clothing in ways that maximize protection while minimizing the need for washing, to move through their days with a grace that concealed the discomforts and inconveniences that their chosen methods of hygiene created. And yet, despite all these efforts, despite the elaborate systems and expensive products, despite the time and energy devoted to maintaining the appearance of cleanliness, the reality beneath the surface was one of accumulating oils and odors, of skin conditions and scalp problems, of undergarments that had become repositories of biological waste that no amount of powder could truly disguise. The women of the 1880s lived in a state of constant vigilance against the revelation of their own humanity, armed with an arsenal of cosmetic weapons designed to maintain an illusion that grew more fragile with each passing day. This system of waterless hygiene created its own internal logic, its own standards of success and failure, its own measures of beauty and respectability that had little connection to actual cleanliness but everything to do with the maintenance of social position and feminine identity. A woman's skill in navigating these challenges became a mark of her refinement, her dedication to these rituals a demonstration of her virtue, her success in maintaining the illusion a source of pride that was shared with daughters and passed down through generations as precious. Wisdom, the fear of water that governed these practices extended beyond the personal realm to influence the design of homes, the layout of cities, and the development of industries that catered to the needs of women who demanded alternatives to traditional washing. Entire businesses grew up around the manufacture and distribution of the powders, creams, and perfumes that made this waterless lifestyle possible, creating economic incentives that reinforced the cultural practices that sustained them as the sun set on each day in 1880s America. As the gas lamps were lit and the curtains drawn against the night air, women across the country engaged in their evening rituals of preparation, removing the layers of powder and perfume that had protected them throughout the day, only to replace them with fresh applications that would see them through the night. They retired to beds that they shared not only with husbands and children, but with the accumulated odors and secretions of bodies that had been maintained but never truly cleaned. Accepting this as the natural order of things, the price of femininity in a world that demanded impossible standards while providing inadequate means for meeting them. And in the morning, the cycle would begin again, the careful application of powders and perfumes, The brushing and airing and perfuming, the elaborate dance of concealment and presentation that defined what it meant to be a respectable woman in an America that was rapidly changing around them, yet clung to these ancient fears and practices with the tenacity of those who had built their identities around the mastery of impossible challenges. The morning light that filtered through the heavy curtains of 1880s American homes illuminated scenes of preparation that would seem like elaborate theatrical performances to modern eyes, yet represented the daily reality of women trapped between the demands of fashion and the limitations of their own bodies. For in this world where water was the enemy and cleanliness was achieved through artifice rather than washing, the very act of getting dressed became an exercise in engineering that required both physical endurance and psychological determination. The corset, that most iconic symbol of 1880s femininity, stood at the center of a complex relationship between elegance and suffering that shaped not only how women looked, but how they moved, breathed, and existed in their own bodies. These rigid constructions of whalebone and steel were designed to create an idealized silhouette that bore little resemblance to the natural female form, cinching waists to impossibly small circumferences while pushing breasts upward and outward in ways that defied both gravity and comfort. But the corset's role in the hygiene challenges of the era went far beyond mere discomfort. For these tightly fitted garments became repositories of sweat and odor that were almost impossible to address within the constraints of the waterless cleaning system that dominated feminine hygiene practices. Worn directly against the skin or separated from it by only the thinnest of chemises, corsets absorb the daily evidence of human biology in ways that no amount of powder or perfume could entirely mask. The process of tight lacing, which was considered the mark of a truly fashionable woman, created additional challenges that went beyond the obvious difficulties of breathing and movement. The extreme compression required to achieve the desired waist measurements meant that women sweated profusely within their corsets, particularly during the summer months when layers of heavy fabric trapped heat against bodies that were already struggling to function within their artificial cots. This sweating, trapped within the rigid confines of whalebone and fabric, created conditions that were ideal for the growth of bacteria and the development of odors that became increasingly difficult to control as the day progressed. The steel clasps and hooks that held these garments in place provided additional surfaces for the accumulation of organic matter, while the intricate construction of the corsets themselves made any attempt at thorough cleaning almost impossible without professional assistance. The undergarments that women wore beneath their corsets presented their own unique challenges in this system of waterless hygiene. For these intimate garments bore the primary responsibility for protecting the expensive outer layers from the reality of bodily functions. The chemises, drawers, and underskirts that formed the foundation of every respectable woman's wardrobe were expected to absorb sweat, menstrual flow, and other bodily secretions while maintaining an appearance of freshness that would not betray their true condition. To the outside world, these undergarments, made primarily of cotton or linen that was considered more absorbent than the silk and wool favored for outer clothing, were changed more frequently than any other part of a woman's wardrobe. Yet even this relative frequency of change was measured in days rather than the daily intervals that modern hygiene practices would suggest. A woman might wear the same chemise for 3 or 4 days before replacing it with a fresh one, relying on the absorbent properties of the fabric and the masking effects of powder and perfume to maintain some semblance of cleanliness. The process of managing menstruation within this system of limited washing and water avoidance created challenges that required both ingenuity and acceptance of discomforts that were simply considered part of the feminine experience. Women relied on cloth rags that could be washed and reused, or on absorbent materials like cotton wool that could be disposed of after use. But the integration of these practical necessities into the complex Layers of underwear and outerwear that fashion demanded required careful planning and constant vigilance. The elaborate construction of 1880s women's clothing meant that a simple trip to the bathroom became a complex operation that could take several minutes to complete, requiring the assistance of servants or family members to navigate the hooks, buttons, and ties that held their garments in place. This complexity, combined with the fear of removing too many layers lest the carefully constructed silhouette be disturbed, meant that women often went hours without attending to their most basic bodily needs, creating additional stress on systems that were already compromised by the constraints of tight lacing and limited mobility. The outer garments worn by fashionable women of the 1880s were themselves designed more for appearance than for practical hygiene considerations, with fabrics chosen for their visual impact rather than their ability to be cleaned or their suitability for the climate in which they were worn. Heavy velvets and brocades, delicate silks and laces, elaborate beading and embroidery all contributed to the stunning visual effect that these women achieved. Yet each of these decorative elements created additional challenges for maintaining cleanliness within the constraints of the water avoidance system that governed their daily lives. The trains and bustles that were fashionable during this period presented particular hygiene challenges, as these extended portions of the dress came into contact with floors that were often dirty and dusty, picking up debris and odors that were then carried back into the home and even into the bedroom. The elaborate pleating and gathering that created the fashionable silhouette also created hidden pockets where dust, debris, and organic matter could accumulate unseen, contributing to odors and stains that might not be discovered until the garment was finally subjected to the dangerous process of professional cleaning. The weight of these elaborate garments, often exceeding 20 pounds when all the layers were combined, placed additional stress on bodies that were already compromised by the constraints of tight lacing and limited mobility. This physical stress contributed to increased sweating and fatigue, creating a cycle where the very clothing designed to create an appearance of delicate femininity actually increased the hygiene challenges that women faced in maintaining that appearance. The social expectations that surrounded these clothing choices meant that women were trapped in a system where their health and comfort were sacrificed to maintain an image that society demanded they present, regardless of the personal cost. The ability to endure these discomforts without complaint was seen as a mark of refinement and moral character, while any admission of the challenges they created was considered a sign of weakness or inadequate breeding. The daily routine of maintaining these elaborate costumes required skills that were passed down from mother to daughter like precious secrets: techniques for spot cleaning delicate fabrics, methods for refreshing garments between wearings, strategies for managing the complex logistics of dressing and undressing that could consume hours of each day. Women became experts in the subtle arts of concealment and presentation, learning to move and sit and stand in ways that would minimize the wear on their clothing while maximizing the visual impact of their carefully constructed appearance. The servants who assisted with these daily rituals became intimate witnesses to the reality behind the facade, helping to manage the complex systems of hooks and laces, brushes and powders that kept their mistresses properly presented to the world. These women, often from lower social classes who could not afford such elaborate garments themselves, developed their own expertise in the maintenance of luxury items, creating a specialized knowledge that was as valuable as it was invisible to the broader society. The economic impact of these hygiene and fashion practices extended far beyond the initial cost of the garments themselves, creating ongoing expenses for the powders, perfumes, and cleaning services that were necessary to maintain them. Families of modest means might sacrifice other necessities to ensure that their daughters and wives were properly dressed, understanding that social position and even marriage prospects could depend on the ability to maintain the appearance of prosperity and refinement. The seasonal rotation of these elaborate wardrobes created additional logistical challenges, as garments that had been worn throughout the summer carried with them the accumulated odors and stains of months of wear, yet could not be simply washed like modern clothing. Instead, they required professional cleaning services that were expensive and often unreliable, or careful storage with aromatic herbs and sachets that promised to refresh them during the months when they were not worn. The psychological impact of living within these constraints shaped not only how women saw themselves, but how they understood their own bodies and their relationships with the physical world around them. The constant vigilance required to maintain the appearance of cleanliness while avoiding the actual practices that would achieve it created a state of anxiety and self-consciousness that permeated every aspect of daily life. From the most public social interactions to the most private moments of personal care, as evening fell and the gas lamps were lit throughout the homes of 1880s America, women across the country began the complex process of undressing, removing layer after layer of fabric that had shaped and constrained their movements throughout the day. The revelation of their actual bodies, freed from the artificial constructions that had defined their public selves, often came as a shock even to themselves, as the contrast between their corseted silhouettes and their natural forms became apparent in the privacy of their bedrooms. The night clothing that replaced these daytime costumes offered some relief from the constraints of fashion. Yet even these garments were designed more for modesty than for comfort or hygiene. The long-sleeved, high-necked nightgowns that were considered appropriate for respectable women covered the body from neck to ankle, creating additional layers that trapped heat and moisture against skin that had already spent the day encased in multiple layers of fabric. The beds to which these women retired each night became repositories of the accumulated odors and secretions of bodies that had been constrained and perfumed but never truly cleaned, creating environments that would seem shocking to modern sensibilities, yet were accepted as normal within the context of the time. The sharing of beds with multiple family members, which was common even among families of moderate means, meant that these accumulated odors and biological evidence became communal experiences that shaped the most intimate aspects of family life. And yet, despite all these challenges and discomforts, despite the elaborate systems and expensive solutions that were required to maintain even the appearance of cleanliness, the women of the 1880s found ways to create beauty and elegance within the constraints they faced. Their mastery of the complex arts of presentation and concealment became sources of pride and accomplishment. Their ability to navigate the impossible demands of their society with grace and dignity became markers of their character and worth. The legacy of these practices extended far beyond the women who endured them, shaping attitudes toward cleanliness, femininity, and the body that would persist for generations, influencing the development of modern hygiene practices and beauty standards in ways that are still visible today. The elaborate systems of concealment and presentation that these women mastered became templates for the cosmetic and fashion industries that would emerge in the 20th century. While their struggles with the basic challenges of maintaining health and cleanliness within impossible constraints became cautionary tales that would eventually contribute to the revolution in hygiene practices that followed in the quiet moments before sleep. As these women lay in their shared beds surrounded by the evidence of their daily struggles with the impossible demands of their society, they carried with them the knowledge that they had done their best within the constraints they faced, that they had maintained the standards their world demanded of them, and that their daughters and granddaughters would inherit not only their beauty and grace, but also, perhaps, the wisdom to find better ways of achieving the cleanliness and health that had eluded their own generation. The intimate landscape of personal grooming in 1880s America extended far beyond the daily rituals of dressing and powder application to encompass the most private aspects of feminine hygiene, areas where the combination of medical ignorance and moral prudery created practices that were both dangerous and ineffective. In the hushed privacy of bedrooms and behind the locked doors of ladies' chambers, women engaged in cleansing rituals that reflected their desperate attempts to maintain health and freshness within a system that provided them with neither adequate knowledge nor appropriate tools. The realm of feminine hygiene, those most personal and rarely discussed aspects of women's lives, had become a shadowy world where folk remedies mixed with commercial preparations, where desperate improvisation replaced sound medical advice, where the fear of moral judgment often outweighed concerns for physical health. In this domain, the water avoidance that characterized daily hygiene practices took on even more problematic dimensions, as women sought alternatives to washing that often did more harm than good. The monthly biological cycles that all women experienced presented particular challenges in this system of limited water use and moral constraints, creating a need for cleansing methods that could address intimate hygiene without violating the taboos that surrounded both sexuality and the body itself. The solutions that emerged from this need reflected both the resourcefulness of women faced with impossible constraints and the dangerous ignorance that characterized medical understanding of female biology during this period. Vinegar, that common household substance that served so many purposes in 1880s domestic life, became a cornerstone of intimate hygiene practices that were passed down through generations of women like closely guarded secrets, diluted with small amounts of water. Vinegar was used for douching and intimate cleansing, with the belief that its acidic properties would kill harmful bacteria and eliminate odors that might betray the reality of female biology. This practice, while based on some legitimate understanding of the antiseptic properties of acid, was often carried to extremes that caused burning, irritation, and damage to delicate tissues that were already stressed by the constraints of tight clothing and limited mobility. The strength of these vinegar solutions varied widely, depending on the knowledge and resources of individual women, with some using concentrations that were strong enough to cause chemical burns, while others diluted the vinegar to such an extent that it provided no antiseptic benefit at all. The lack of standardized medical advice or reliable information about appropriate concentrations meant that each woman was essentially conducting her own dangerous experiment with substances that could either help or harm, depending on factors that she had no way of understanding or controlling. Whiskey and other alcoholic spirits found their way into these intimate hygiene practices as well, with women believing that the antiseptic properties of alcohol could provide cleansing and protection that water could not offer. These alcohol-based douches and washes promised the dual benefits of cleansing and strengthening, with some women convinced that the burning sensation that accompanied their use was evidence of their effectiveness in destroying harmful substances that might otherwise cause disease or odor. The use of whiskey for intimate hygiene purposes created its own set of problems, as the alcohol dried and irritated delicate tissues while potentially destroying the natural bacterial balance that provided protection against infection. Women who relied on these harsh solutions often found themselves caught in cycles of irritation and attempted treatment that led to increasingly severe problems. Yet the secrecy that surrounded these practices meant that they had little opportunity to learn from the experiences of others or to seek more appropriate alternatives, commercial preparations designed specifically for feminine hygiene began to appear in the 1880s, marketed through discreet advertisements in ladies' magazines and sold through apothecaries who understood the need for privacy in these matters. These products promised gentle yet effective cleansing through the use of natural ingredients that were claimed to be both safe and morally appropriate for use by respectable women. Many of these commercial douches and feminine washes contained ingredients that were no safer than the home remedies they were meant to replace, with formulations that included everything from carbolic acid to mercury compounds, from arsenic solutions to preparations containing lead that promised to whiten and purify while slowly poisoning the women who used them. The marketing of these products relied heavily on fear and shame, suggesting that feminine odors were signs of moral failing or inadequate refinement, while promising that their use would restore the purity and freshness that proper ladies were expected to maintain. The process of using these products in the privacy of the home required equipment and preparations that were often elaborate and time-consuming, involving specialized syringes and douching apparatus that had to be carefully cleaned and maintained to prevent the spread of infection. The complexity of these procedures, combined with the secrecy that surrounded them, meant that many women had little understanding of proper techniques or safety precautions, leading to injuries and infections that they were often too embarrassed to seek medical treatment. For the monthly management of menstruation within this system of harsh cleansing agents and limited washing created additional challenges that required both creativity and acceptance of discomforts that would be considered intolerable by modern standards. The cloth rags that served as sanitary protection had to be managed within a system that allowed for minimal washing, leading to practices of soaking in vinegar or alcohol solutions that promised to disinfect and deodorize materials that would be reused month after month. The social isolation that surrounded menstruation during this period meant that young women often entered their reproductive years with little knowledge of what to expect or how to manage the practicalities of their monthly cycles. The information they did receive was often incomplete or inaccurate, passed down through generations of women who had themselves learned through trial and error, creating a cycle of ignorance that perpetuated dangerous practices and unnecessary suffering. The connection between these harsh, intimate hygiene practices and the high rates of reproductive health problems experienced by women of the 1880s was not understood at the time, as the medical establishment had little interest in or understanding of female biology beyond its reproductive functions. Women who suffered from chronic infections, painful inflammations, or other problems related to their intimate hygiene practices were often told that such suffering was the natural lot of womankind, a consequence of their moral weakness or inadequate attention to proper feminine behavior. The psychological impact of these secretive and often painful hygiene practices extended far beyond their immediate physical effects, contributing to a sense of shame and anxiety about the body that could persist throughout a woman's life. The message that female biology was inherently dirty and dangerous, requiring constant vigilance and harsh intervention to maintain respectability, shaped not only how women cared for themselves, but how they understood their own worth and place in society. The economic aspect of these intimate hygiene practices created additional burdens for families who were already struggling to maintain the appearance of respectability that society demanded. The cost of commercial preparations, specialized equipment, and the materials needed for homemade solutions could represent a significant portion of a household's budget. Yet these expenses were considered necessary investments in feminine virtue and social standing. The seasonal variations in these hygiene practices reflected the limited heating and bathing facilities available in most homes, with winter months bringing additional challenges as women sought to maintain intimate cleanliness in conditions where even the minimal water use that these practices required could be difficult to manage safely. The risk of illness from exposure to cold while engaging in these cleansing rituals had to be balanced against the social and moral risks of neglecting feminine hygiene altogether. The development of patent medicines and commercial preparations specifically marketed for feminine hygiene needs represented one of the earliest examples of targeted marketing to women, with advertisements that used coded language and discrete imagery to convey their messages without violating the moral standards of the time. These advertisements promised not only physical cleanliness, but social acceptance and moral purity, suggesting that the use of their products was essential for maintaining respectability and attracting appropriate male attention. The regional variations in these intimate hygiene practices reflected the diverse cultural backgrounds and economic circumstances of American women in the 1880s, with immigrant communities often bringing their own traditional practices that mixed with American customs to create unique hybrid approaches to feminine cleanliness. The exchange of information about these practices within women's social networks created informal systems of education and support that helped women navigate the challenges of maintaining intimate hygiene within the constraints of their time. The religious and moral dimensions of these hygiene practices reflected the complex relationship between physical cleanliness and spiritual purity that characterized much of 1880s American culture, with some religious groups promoting specific approaches to feminine hygiene as expressions of moral virtue, while others considered such attention to bodily matters as evidence of carnal preoccupation that was inappropriate for properly spiritual women. As the night deepened and the household settled into sleep, these women carried with them the burning sensations and lingering discomforts of their private cleansing rituals, the evidence of their attempts to maintain the purity and freshness that their society demanded while working within systems that provided neither adequate knowledge nor appropriate tools for achieving these goals. Their intimate struggles with the most basic aspects of feminine hygiene represented not personal failures, but the inevitable consequences of a society that demanded impossible standards while providing inadequate means for meeting them. The legacy of these dangerous and often ineffective practices would persist well into the 20th century, influencing the development of commercial feminine hygiene products and shaping attitudes toward female biology that took generations to overcome. The secrecy and shame that surrounded these intimate aspects of women's lives created barriers to medical research and open discussion that slowed the development of safer and more effective approaches to feminine hygiene, leaving women to struggle with problems that could have been more easily addressed through better understanding and more appropriate treatments in the quiet darkness of their bedrooms. As these women prepared for sleep after their evening rituals of harsh cleansing and desperate attempts at purification, they represented not only the victims of ignorance and social constraint, but also the embodiment of resilience and determination in the face of impossible challenges. Their willingness to endure pain and discomfort in the pursuit of respectability and health, however misguided their methods might have seemed, demonstrated the strength and resourcefulness that would eventually contribute to the changes that would improve the lives of their daughters and granddaughters. The morning light that crept through the heavy curtains of 1880s bedrooms illuminated not only the elaborate preparations that would begin each day, but also the consequences of hygiene practices that prioritized appearance over health, concealment over cleanliness. Nowhere were these consequences more visible than in the realm of cosmetics and beauty preparations, where the pursuit of an idealized feminine appearance led women to adorn themselves with substances that promised beauty while delivering slow, insidious poisoning. The cosmetic practices of the 1880s represented the culmination of centuries of alchemical tradition mixed with emerging industrial chemistry, creating a marketplace of beauty products that ranged from the merely ineffective to the actively lethal. The women who applied these preparations each morning, carefully following routines that had been passed down through generations or learned from the latest fashion magazines, had little understanding of the chemical processes they were engaging with or the long-term consequences of their daily beauty rituals. The foundation of any Respectable woman's cosmetic routine lay in the achievement of the pale, translucent complexion that was considered the epitome of feminine beauty during this period. This pursuit of pallor, which signified both gentility and moral purity, led to the widespread use of face powders and skin preparations that contained some of the most dangerous substances known to chemistry, applied daily with the trusting faith of women who believed that beauty and virtue were inseparably connected. Lead-based cosmetics formed the cornerstone of this pursuit of pale perfection, with face powders containing white lead offering coverage and opacity that could transform even the most ruddy complexion into the fashionable pallor that society demanded. These powders, marketed under romantic names like pearl powder and Venetian bloom, promised not only immediate beauty but lasting improvement in the skin's natural condition, with advertisements claiming that regular use would permanently enhance the complexion's clarity and refinement. The application of these lead-based powders required techniques that ensured even coverage and natural appearance, with women learning to build up layers of product that would withstand the scrutiny of daylight while maintaining the illusion of natural beauty. The process began with the application of cold creams and base preparations designed to create a smooth canvas for the powder, followed by the careful dusting of the lead-based product using soft brushes or powder puffs made from the finest materials. The immediate effects, these lead cosmetics were undeniably impressive, creating complexions of porcelain-like perfection that satisfied the aesthetic demands of the era while masking the natural variations in skin tone and texture that were considered marks of inferior breeding or inadequate refinement. The psychological satisfaction that women derived from achieving this idealized appearance often outweighed any concerns they might have had about the safety of the products they were using, particularly since the most serious consequences of lead poisoning developed slowly and were often attributed to other causes. The systemic effects of daily lead exposure through cosmetic use created a range of health problems that were rarely connected to their actual cause, with women suffering from chronic fatigue, digestive problems, nervous system disorders, and reproductive difficulties that were attributed to everything from moral weakness to inadequate spiritual devotion. The lead that accumulated in their bodies over months and years of cosmetic use affected not only their own health, but that of their children, contributing to miscarriages, birth defects, and infant mortality, rates that were accepted as natural consequences of the feminine condition. Arsenic found its way into the cosmetic routines of 1880s women through a variety of products that promised everything from skin whitening to hair strengthening, with this deadly poison being marketed as a beauty enhancement that could provide lasting improvements to feminine appearance. Arsenic-based complexion wafers, designed to be eaten like candy, promised to improve the skin from within, while arsenic soaps and face washes offered external application of this dangerous substance under the guise of gentle cleansing and beautification. The appeal of arsenic as a cosmetic ingredient lay partly in its genuine ability to create short-term improvements in skin appearance, as small doses of arsenic could stimulate circulation and create a temporary glow that mimicked the effects of health and vitality. This immediate gratification reinforced the belief that arsenic-based products were beneficial, creating a cycle of use that continued until the cumulative effects of arsenic poisoning became impossible to ignore. The marketing of arsenic cosmetics relied heavily on testimonials from satisfied customers who reported dramatic improvements in their complexions, with advertisements featuring before and after illustrations that showed the transformation possible through regular use of these dangerous products. The social pressure to achieve and maintain the appearance of health and beauty created a market for these substances that persisted. Despite mounting evidence of their harmful effects, mercury-based cosmetics offered yet another avenue for the slow poisoning of women who trusted in the promises of beauty and refinement that these products offered. Mercury preparations promised to lighten and brighten the complexion while eliminating freckles, blemishes, and other imperfections that were considered marks of inferior breeding or inadequate care. The application of these mercury-based creams and ointments became part of the nightly ritual of beauty preparation, with women carefully massaging these dangerous substances into their skin with the belief that they were investing in their long-term attractiveness and social acceptability. The effects of mercury poisoning through cosmetic use created symptoms that were often mistaken for other conditions common to women of the era, with tremors, memory problems, and emotional instability being attributed to the inherent weakness of the feminine constitution rather than to the toxic substances that were being applied to the skin on a daily basis. The dental problems associated with mercury exposure were particularly common among women who used mercury-based cosmetics, with tooth loss and gum disease being accepted as natural consequences of aging rather than as symptoms of chemical poisoning. The perfumes and scented preparations that completed the cosmetic routines of 1880s women carried their own hidden dangers, with many containing alcohol bases that had been contaminated with methanol or other toxic substances during the distillation process. The daily application of these perfumes to pulse points and clothing created opportunities for absorption of these dangerous chemicals through the skin, while the inhalation of their vapors provided additional routes for toxic exposure. The elaborate perfume rituals that were considered essential to feminine grooming involved not only the application of commercial preparations, but also the use of scented powders, pomades, and oils that could contain everything from toxic plant extracts to dangerous synthetic chemicals that were poorly understood and completely unregulated. The layering of these various scented products created complex chemical interactions that could enhance their toxic effects while masking the symptoms of poisoning beneath a socially acceptable explanation of feminine delicacy and sensitivity. The economic impact of these cosmetic practices extended far beyond the immediate cost of the products themselves, as the health consequences of their use created ongoing medical expenses that could devastate family finances. The chronic illnesses associated with cosmetic poisoning required expensive treatments that were often ineffective, while the loss of productivity that resulted from these health problems could affect entire households that depended on women's labor for their economic survival. The social dynamics surrounding cosmetic use created pressure that made it difficult for women to avoid these dangerous practices, even when they suspected that their beauty preparations might be contributing to their health problems. The association between cosmetic use and respectability meant that a woman who appeared in public without the proper application of powders and perfumes risked being seen as slovenly or morally questionable, while the competitive nature of feminine beauty created incentives to use the most effective products available, regardless of their potential dangers. The regional variations in cosmetic practices reflected both the availability of different products and the cultural traditions that influenced beauty standards in different parts of the country. Urban women had access to the latest commercial preparations imported from Europe and manufactured in American cities, while rural women often relied more heavily on homemade cosmetics that could be equally dangerous, but were made from locally available ingredients that promised the same beauty benefits at lower cost. The seasonal aspects of cosmetic use created additional challenges and opportunities for toxic exposure, with summer heat increasing the absorption of dangerous chemicals through the skin, while winter cold could cause cosmetic preparations to freeze or separate in ways that concentrated their most harmful components. The social season that brought increased attention to feminine appearance also brought increased use of cosmetic preparations, creating periods of intensified exposure to toxic substances that coincided with the times when women were most visible in public society. The generational transmission of cosmetic sleaze Knowledge created chains of toxic exposure that could affect entire families. As mothers passed down to their daughters not only their beauty secrets, but also their poisoning practices. The trust that young women placed in their elders. Guidance meant that dangerous cosmetic practices could persist for generations, with each new cohort of women adding their own innovations and improvements to traditions that were fundamentally based on the application of toxic substances to the body. The international trade in cosmetic ingredients brought exotic dangers into American homes, with imported substances that promised rare and exotic beauty benefits, often containing contaminants or adulterants that made them even more dangerous than their domestic counterparts. The lack of regulation or quality control in this international trade meant that women had no way of knowing what they were actually applying to their bodies, trusting in brand names and marketing promises that had little connection to the actual safety or effectiveness of the products they were purchasing. As the evening hours approached and women began their ritualistic removal of the day's cosmetic applications, they unwittingly prepared their skin for the absorption of even more toxic substances through their nighttime beauty preparations. The cold creams and overnight treatments that promised to repair and rejuvenate the complexion while they slept often contained the same dangerous ingredients as their daytime counterparts, ensuring that the cycle of toxic exposure continued around the clock. The dreams of these women, as they lay in their beds with faces covered in mercury creams and arsenic preparations, were often troubled by the neurological effects of the poisons they had applied in pursuit of beauty. Yet they continued to trust in the promises of the cosmetic industry and the wisdom of beauty, traditions that valued appearance over health. Their commitment to these dangerous practices represented not vanity or foolishness, but the rational response of women who understood that their social and economic survival depended on their ability to maintain the appearance of beauty and refinement that their society demanded. Regardless of the personal cost, the legacy of these cosmetic poisoning practices would eventually contribute to the development of consumer protection laws and cosmetic safety regulations. But not before generations of women had sacrificed their health in pursuit of the impossible beauty standards that defined feminine worth in 1880s America. Their suffering, largely invisible and rarely acknowledged, became part of the hidden cost of maintaining the elaborate facade of refinement and elegance that characterized the Gilded Age's approach to feminine identity in the quiet hours before dawn. As these women lay surrounded by the chemical evidence of their daily beauty rituals, their bodies slowly processing the accumulated toxins of months and years of cosmetic use, they represented both the victims of a society that valued appearance over health and the embodiment of the determination and courage that would eventually lead to better understanding and safer practices for the generations that would follow. The intimate world of personal adornment in 1880s America extended far beyond the application of cosmetics to encompass a complex ecosystem of accessories, jewelry, and decorative objects that promised to enhance feminine beauty while creating hidden pathways for disease, transmission, and infection. In this realm, where every detail of appearance carried social significance, the pursuit of elegance often collided with basic hygiene principles in ways that created dangers as subtle as they were persistent. The elaborate hairstyles that defined feminine fashion during this period required not only time and skill to create, but also an extensive collection of implements and accessories that were shared, borrowed, and passed down through families and social circles with little consideration for the microscopic passengers they might carry. Hairpins, combs, and brushes became vectors for the transmission of parasites and infections that could spread through entire communities of women who shared these intimate tools of beauty. The hairbrushes that were essential to daily grooming were often made with natural bristles from boars or other animals, creating surfaces that were ideal for harboring bacteria, lice, and other unwanted organisms that could survive for extended periods between uses. These brushes, particularly those made with the finest and most expensive bristles, were frequently loaned between friends and family members, creating networks of potential contamination that could spread scalp infections and parasitic infestations throughout entire social circles. The cleaning of these brushes was often limited to the removal of loose hair and the occasional application of perfumed powders that promised to freshen and sanitize the bristles. Yet these superficial treatments did little to eliminate the deeper contamination that could accumulate within the dense bristle structure. The expense and craftsmanship represented by fine hair brushes made their owners reluctant to subject them to the harsh cleaning methods that might have been more effective, leading to the preservation of beautiful objects that served as repositories of biological contamination. Combs, particularly those made from tortoiseshell ivory or other organic materials, presented similar challenges in terms of sanitation and disease transmission. The fine teeth of these combs could harbor particles of skin, oil, and other organic matter that provided ideal breeding grounds for bacteria and parasites, while the intricate carved decorations that made them fashionable also created hidden recesses where contamination could persist despite apparently thorough cleaning efforts. The practice of sharing combs was so common that it was rarely questioned, with mothers and daughters, sisters, and friends regularly using each other's grooming implements without consideration for the potential health consequences. This sharing was seen as a natural expression of intimacy and trust. Yet it created opportunities for the transmission of scalp conditions, lice infestations, and bacterial infections that could affect entire families or social groups. Hair ornaments and decorative accessories presented their own unique challenges in terms of hygiene and health, with the materials used in their construction often creating environments that were conducive to bacterial growth or chemical contamination. Hairpins made from metals that contained lead or other toxic substances could leach these dangerous chemicals into the scalp over time, while organic decorations made from feathers, flowers, or other natural materials could harbor bacteria or parasites that were introduced into the hair during the manufacturing process. The elaborate hair ornaments, favored by wealthy women, often incorporated precious metals and gemstones that were held in place by adhesives or cements that could contain toxic substances, creating opportunities for chemical exposure through prolonged contact with the scalp and hair. The weight of these ornaments could also cause damage to the hair and scalp through constant tension and pressure, leading to conditions that compromised the natural protective barriers and made infection more likely. Earrings presented particular risks in terms of infection and disease transmission, as the piercing process was often performed under less than sterile conditions using implements that were rarely properly cleaned or sterilized between uses. The healing process for ear piercings could take weeks or months, during which time the wounds were vulnerable to bacterial infection, particularly when irritated by heavy or poorly made jewelry that could introduce foreign substances into the healing tissue. The sharing of earrings was common among women of all social classes, with friends and family members regularly borrowing each other's jewelry for special occasions or simply for variety in their daily appearance. This practice created opportunities for the transmission of bacterial infections, fungal conditions, and other health problems that could affect the ears and surrounding tissues. Yet the social conventions that governed the lending and borrowing of jewelry made it difficult to refuse such requests without giving offense. The materials used in costume jewelry and less expensive accessories often contained substances that could cause allergic reactions or chemical burns when in prolonged contact with the skin. Yet these reactions were rarely connected to their actual cause. Women who developed rashes, discoloration, or other skin problems from wearing cheap jewelry often attributed these symptoms to other causes, continuing to wear the offending pieces while seeking treatment for conditions that could have been easily resolved by simply removing the source of irritation. Gloves, which were considered essential accessories for any respectable woman venturing out in public, created their own hygiene challenges as they trapped sweat and bacteria against the hands while making frequent washing impractical due to the delicate materials from which they were often made. The finest gloves, made from kid leather or other expensive materials, required special care that made regular cleaning impossible, leading to the accumulation of organic matter and bacterial contamination that could cause skin infections and other health problems. The practice of wearing gloves for extended periods, particularly during social events or formal occasions, created conditions that were ideal for bacterial growth, with a warm, moist environment inside the gloves providing perfect conditions for the multiplication of harmful organisms. The social necessity of wearing gloves in public meant that women often had little choice but to endure these uncomfortable and unhygienic conditions, accepting skin problems and infections as necessary sacrifices to social propriety. Jewelry made from organic materials presented unique challenges in terms of maintenance and hygiene, with items made from ivory, bone, coral, or other natural substances requiring special care to prevent deterioration while also creating surfaces that could harbor bacteria and other contaminants. The porous nature of many of these materials made them impossible to thoroughly clean or sterilize, yet their beauty and symbolic value made them treasured possessions that were worn regularly despite the potential health risks they represented. The storage of jewelry and accessories in the humid, poorly ventilated conditions that characterized many 1880s homes created additional opportunities for the growth of mold, bacteria, and other harmful organisms that could contaminate these items before they were worn. Jewelry boxes and storage containers were rarely cleaned or aired, creating microenvironments that could preserve and concentrate biological contamination for extended periods. The repair and maintenance of jewelry and accessories was often performed by craftsmen who worked under conditions that would be considered unsanitary by modern standards, with tools and workspaces that were rarely cleaned or disinfected between projects. This meant that items sent for repair could return to their owners carrying contamination from other pieces or from the workshop environment itself, creating new opportunities for disease transmission. The social rituals surrounding the wearing and sharing of jewelry created complex networks of potential contamination that extended far beyond individual families to encompass entire communities of women who participated in the elaborate social customs of the era. The borrowing of jewelry for weddings, parties, and other special occasions created opportunities for the transmission of skin conditions, allergic reactions, and infections that could affect multiple generations of women who shared these treasured family pieces. The symbolic and emotional significance attached to certain pieces of jewelry made their owners reluctant to subject them to cleaning methods that might damage their appearance or sentimental value, leading to the preservation of beautiful but contaminated objects that carried both precious memories and potential health risks. Family heirloom jewelry, in particular, could accumulate decades or even centuries of biological contamination while being passed down through generations of women who valued their heritage more than their health. The manufacturing processes used to create jewelry and accessories during the 1880s often involved the use of toxic chemicals and dangerous materials that could leave residual contamination on finished pieces, creating opportunities for chemical exposure through skin contact. The lack of regulation or quality control in the jewelry industry meant that consumers had no way of knowing what substances might be present in their accessories, trusting in the reputation of manufacturers and retailers who themselves might have little understanding of the potential health risks associated with their products. As evening approached and women began the ritual of removing their jewelry and accessories, They often unknowingly transferred contamination from these items to their storage containers, their clothing, and their personal belongings, creating reservoirs of biological and chemical contamination that could affect not only themselves, but their families and servants who might come into contact with these items during cleaning and maintenance activities. The dreams of these women, as they slept surrounded by the accessories that had adorned them during the day, were sometimes troubled by the allergic reactions and chemical sensitivities that resulted from prolonged exposure to contaminated or toxic jewelry. Yet they rarely made the connection between their symptoms and their beloved personal adornments. Their commitment to maintaining the appearance of elegance and refinement that their society demanded meant that they continued to wear and share these potentially dangerous items, accepting the health consequences as simply part of the price of feminine beauty and social acceptability. The legacy of these accessory-related health problems would eventually contribute to the development of safety standards and regulations for jewelry and personal accessories, but not before generations of women had suffered from infections, allergic reactions, and chemical exposures that could have been prevented through better understanding of hygiene principles and manufacturing safety. Their experiences became part of the hidden history of women's health, largely undocumented and rarely acknowledged, yet representing a significant aspect of the complex relationship between beauty, social status, and physical well-being that characterized feminine life in 1880s America. The intimate geography of domestic life in 1880s America created environments where the most private aspects of human existence were shared, negotiated, and endured within spaces that were never designed to accommodate the complex needs of families struggling to maintain both privacy and cleanliness within the constraints of their time. The bedrooms and sleeping quarters that served as nightly refuges from the demands of public presentation became repositories of accumulated odors, secretions, and biological evidence that no amount of perfume or powder could entirely mask. The practice of sharing beds, which was necessitated by both economic constraints and the limited space available in most homes, created intimate communities of family members whose individual hygiene challenges became collective experiences that shaped the most private moments of daily life. Children slept with parents, siblings shared sleeping spaces well into adulthood, and even servants were often accommodated in rooms with multiple occupants, creating complex social dynamics around issues of cleanliness, comfort, and personal space that had to be negotiated anew each night. The beds themselves, massive constructions of wood and metal that were designed to last for generations, became repositories of the accumulated biological history of all who had slept within them, their horsehair mattresses and feather-filled quilts absorbing sweat, oils, and other bodily secretions over months and years of use without the benefit of regular washing or airing that might have reduced their organic load. These mattresses often passed down through families as valuable household assets, carried within their depths the evidence of decades of human habitation, creating sleeping environments that were rich with the scents and substances of those who had occupied them. The bedding that covered these mattresses presented its own challenges in terms of cleanliness and maintenance, with sheets and pillowcases that were changed infrequently due to the labor-intensive process of washing and the limited supply of linens that most families could afford. The fine cotton and linen sheets that were prized by families of means were often too delicate or too expensive to subject to frequent washing, leading to practices of airing and spot cleaning that could extend the time between complete launderings 2 weeks or even months. The pillows that supported the heads of these sleeping families became particularly problematic. Repositories of oils, perspiration, and the accumulation of hair pomades and perfumes that were applied each evening as part of bedtime preparations, filled with down feathers or horsehair that could not be easily cleaned or replaced. These pillows developed distinctive odors and textures over time that reflected the personal habits and hygiene practices of their users, creating intimate markers of individual identity that persisted long after the sleepers themselves had moved on. The quilts and coverlets that provided warmth during cold nights were often elaborate works of textile art that represented months or years of careful handwork. Yet their construction made them almost impossible to wash without destroying the intricate patterns and delicate fabrics that made them valuable. These bed coverings accumulated dust, skin cells, and other organic matter over time, creating environments that were ideal for the growth of dust mites and other microscopic organisms that could contribute to respiratory problems and allergic reactions among the bed's occupants. The sharing of personal items within these sleeping spaces created additional opportunities for the transmission of skin conditions, parasitic infections, and other health problems that could spread rapidly through families who lived in such close proximity. Nightgowns and sleeping clothes were often shared between family members of similar size, while personal grooming items like brushes and combs were frequently used by multiple people without the thorough cleaning that would have been necessary to prevent the spread of lice, skin conditions, and other contagious problems. The chamber pots that served as nighttime toilets in bedrooms that lacked direct access to outdoor facilities created their own hygiene challenges, as these vessels often went empty for hours or even days before being cleaned, filling sleeping spaces with odors that became so familiar that they were barely noticed by the families who lived with them. The responsibility for emptying and cleaning these vessels often fell to the youngest family members or to servants whose own sleeping arrangements might be even more crowded and uncomfortable than those of their employers. The ventilation in these sleeping spaces was often inadequate, with windows that were kept closed against night air that was believed to carry diseases and harmful influences, creating environments where odors and moisture accumulated throughout the night, without the benefit of fresh air circulation that might have reduced the intensity of these conditions. The heavy curtains and bed hangings that were fashionable during this period further restricted air movement, creating intimate enclosed spaces where the breath, perspiration, and other bodily emanations of multiple sleepers could concentrate and intensify. The lighting available in these bedrooms was limited to candles, oil lamps, or early gas fixtures that created their own odors and air quality problems while providing inadequate illumination for the cleaning and maintenance tasks that might have improved hygiene conditions. The risk of fire associated with these lighting methods also limited their use, meaning that much of the intimate care and maintenance of sleeping spaces took place in dim conditions. That made thorough cleaning difficult or impossible. The storage of clothing and personal belongings within these sleeping spaces created additional layers of odor accumulation, as soiled garments and unwashed linens were often kept in the same rooms where people slept, creating complex mixtures of scents that reflected the daily activities and hygiene practices of the entire family. Wardrobes and storage chests that were rarely aired or cleaned became repositories of accumulated odors that could permeate the entire sleeping environment, making it impossible to escape the evidence of inadequate washing and cleaning practices. The seasonal variations in sleeping arrangements created additional challenges and opportunities for hygiene problems, with summer heat intensifying odors and increasing perspiration, while winter cold made the minimal washing that did occur even more difficult and uncomfortable. The practice of sharing body heat during cold weather meant that families often slept in even closer proximity during the months when their accumulated odors were most likely to be intensified by the lack of ventilation and air circulation. The social dynamics within these shared sleeping spaces required constant negotiation and accommodation, as family members had to balance their individual needs for comfort and cleanliness against the practical limitations of their living arrangements and the social expectations that governed family relationships. Children learned to accept odors and discomforts that they might have found unpleasant, while adults develop strategies for managing their own hygiene needs. Within the constraints of shared living spaces, the emotional and psychological effects of living in such intimate proximity to the bodily functions and hygiene challenges of other family members created complex relationships with issues of cleanliness, privacy, and personal space that could persist throughout an individual's lifetime. The acceptance of conditions that would be considered intolerable by modern standards became a mark of family loyalty and social adaptation. While any complaint about these conditions was often seen as evidence of selfishness or inadequate commitment to family solidarity, the dreams and sleep quality of people living in these conditions were often affected by the accumulated odors and discomforts of their sleeping environments. Yet these effects were rarely connected to hygiene issues, but were instead attributed to moral, spiritual, or medical problems that required different types of intervention. The idea that environmental factors could affect health and well-being was still in its infancy, leaving families to struggle with problems that could have been improved through better understanding of basic hygiene principles. The economic constraints that necessitated these shared sleeping arrangements also limited the resources available for improving hygiene conditions, creating cycles where families who most needed better sanitation were least able to afford the materials and labor that would have made such improvements possible. The expense associated with frequent laundering, bed replacement, and room cleaning made these improvements luxury items that were beyond the reach of most families, regardless of their awareness of hygiene issues. As morning light crept into these shared sleeping spaces, illuminating the evidence of another night spent in intimate proximity to the bodily functions and hygiene challenges of multiple family members, the occupants would begin another day of managing their individual cleanliness needs within the constraints of systems that provided few good solutions to problems that affected every aspect of their daily lives. Their resilience and adaptability in the face of these challenges represented not acceptance of poor hygiene, but creative responses to impossible circumstances that required constant innovation and compromise. The legacy of these shared sleeping arrangements and their associated hygiene challenges would eventually contribute to changes in housing design, family structure, and social expectations about privacy and personal space, but not before generations of families had adapted to conditions that shaped their understanding of intimacy, cleanliness, and family relationships in ways that would influence American domestic life for decades to come. The landscape of oral hygiene in 1880s America presented a tableau of decay and discomfort that was accepted as the natural consequence of human existence, where the very act of smiling became a carefully calculated social performance designed to conceal the reality of rotting teeth and diseased gums that were hidden behind the facade of feminine refinement. In this world where appearance trumped health and social conventions demanded the maintenance of beauty at any cost, the mouth became another battlefield where the war between image and reality was fought, with weapons that often did more harm than good. The understanding of dental health during this period was still primitive by modern standards, with theories about tooth decay and gum disease that were based more on folk wisdom and moral judgment than on scientific understanding of the bacterial processes that actually caused oral health problems. The prevailing belief that tooth problems were the result of moral failing, inadequate spiritual devotion, or inherent constitutional weakness meant that women who suffered from dental issues were often ashamed to seek treatment, or even to acknowledge the extent of their problems. The tools available for oral hygiene were limited and often dangerous, with toothbrushes that were expensive, poorly made, and frequently shared among family members in ways that could spread infection and disease from one person to another. These brushes, when they were available at all, were often made with bristles that were too hard or too soft to be effective, attached to handles that were difficult to grip or maneuver, and designed more for appearance than for functional effectiveness. In removing the food particles and bacterial buildup that contributed to decay and disease, the tooth powders and cleaning preparations that were marketed to women promised miraculous improvements in oral health while containing ingredients that were often more harmful than helpful, with abrasive substances that wore away tooth enamel, acidic compounds that contributed to decay, and toxic materials that could cause chemical burns or systemic poisoning when used regularly over extended periods. These preparations, sold under romantic names that suggested purity and effectiveness, became part of elaborate oral hygiene rituals that provided psychological satisfaction while creating new health problems. The practice of tooth cleaning, when it occurred at all, was often limited to the visible front teeth that would be seen when a woman smiled or spoke, with the back teeth receiving little or no attention until they became sources of pain that could no longer be ignored. This selective cleaning approach reflected both the limitations of available tools and techniques and the social priorities that governed feminine hygiene practices, where appearance took precedence over health and visible improvement was valued more than comprehensive care. The breath freshening techniques that were considered essential to feminine refinement relied heavily on the masking effects of strong flavors and scents, rather than addressing the underlying causes of bad breath that stemmed from poor oral hygiene and dental disease. Women consumed breath-freshening lozenges, candies, and liquids that contained everything from alcohol to toxic plant extracts, believing that these substances would provide lasting improvement in their oral freshness while often creating new health problems through the ingestion of dangerous chemicals. The social rituals surrounding eating and drinking created additional challenges for maintaining oral hygiene, as the elaborate meals and social customs of the era often involved foods that were particularly likely to contribute to tooth decay and gum disease. The multiple courses of rich, sugary foods that characterized formal dining, combined with the limited opportunities for oral cleaning that were available in social settings, meant that women's teeth were subjected to extended periods of exposure to decaying substances without the benefit of effective cleaning methods. The fashion for tight-laced corsets created additional problems for oral health by restricting breathing and circulation in ways that could affect the health of the gums and other oral tissues, while the stress and discomfort associated with these garments could contribute to tooth grinding and jaw clenching that caused additional damage to teeth that were already compromised by poor hygiene and inadequate care. The connection between these seemingly unrelated aspects of feminine fashion and oral health was not understood at the time, leaving women to suffer from dental problems that seemed to have no apparent cause. The economic barriers to dental care meant that most women had little access to professional treatment for their oral health problems, relying instead on home remedies and folk treatments that were passed down through families and social networks with little regard for their safety or effectiveness. The cost of dental services, when they were available at all, was prohibitive for most families, while the pain and fear associated with dental procedures performed without effective anesthesia made many women reluctant to seek treatment until their problems became unbearable. The tools and techniques used by the dental practitioners who were available during this period were often primitive and dangerous, with extraction being the most common treatment for dental problems and preventive care being virtually unknown. The unsanitary conditions under which many dental procedures were performed created additional risks of infection and complications, while the lack of understanding about pain management meant that women often endured excruciating procedures with little or no relief from their suffering. The social stigma associated with visible dental problems created additional psychological stress for women who were already struggling with the physical discomfort of tooth decay and gum disease. as the inability to smile or speak without revealing dental imperfections could affect social relationships, marriage prospects, and professional opportunities in ways that extended far beyond the immediate health consequences of poor oral hygiene. The patent medicines and commercial preparations that promised relief from toothache and dental problems often contained dangerous substances like cocaine, opium, or alcohol that provided temporary pain relief while creating new health problems through addiction and chemical dependency. These medications, marketed specifically to women as gentle and safe alternatives to professional dental care, became part of daily routines that masked serious dental problems while preventing the seeking of appropriate treatment. The connection between oral health and overall systemic health was not understood during this period, meaning that the infections and inflammations associated with poor dental hygiene were allowed to persist and spread without recognition of their potential to affect other aspects of physical well-being. The chronic infections that resulted from untreated dental problems could contribute to a wide range of health issues that were attributed to other causes, creating cycles of illness and suffering that could have been prevented through better oral hygiene and dental care. The seasonal variations in oral hygiene practices reflected the limited availability of fresh foods and clean water during certain times of the year, with winter months bringing additional challenges as families relied more heavily on preserved foods that were high in sugar and salt while having less access to fresh fruits and vegetables that might have provided some protection against dental problems. The regional differences in oral hygiene practices reflected both the availability of different products and services and the cultural traditions that influenced attitudes toward dental care in different parts of the country. Urban women had access to a wider variety of commercial dental products and professional services, while rural women often relied more heavily on traditional remedies and home treatments that might be less effective but were more readily available and affordable. The generational transmission of oral hygiene practices meant that poor dental care habits were often passed down from mothers to daughters, along with other aspects of feminine knowledge and tradition, creating cycles of dental problems that could affect entire families and communities. The lack of reliable information about effective oral hygiene techniques meant that well-intentioned mothers might teach their daughters practices that were actually harmful, perpetuating problems that could have been prevented through better education and understanding. As evening fell and women across America prepared for sleep, many would spend their final waking moments dealing with the tooth pain and oral discomfort that were constant companions in their daily lives, applying homemade remedies or commercial preparations that promised relief while often providing little more than temporary distraction from problems that would return with increased intensity in the morning. The dreams of these women were often disturbed by the chronic pain and discomfort associated with their dental problems. Yet they continued to prioritize the maintenance of their appearance over the pursuit of actual health, accepting tooth loss and oral disease as inevitable consequences of femininity, rather than as problems that could be addressed through better understanding and more effective treatment approaches. The legacy of these oral hygiene practices would eventually contribute to significant improvements in dental care and preventive techniques, but not before generations of women had suffered from preventable dental problems that affected not only their physical health, but their social relationships, self-esteem, and overall quality of life in ways that were rarely acknowledged or addressed by the medical and social systems of their time. The streets of 1880s American cities presented an olfactory assault that began the moment one stepped outside the protective barriers of home and continued throughout any journey through the urban landscape, creating an environment where personal hygiene was constantly challenged by external forces that made cleanliness not just difficult, to achieve, but almost impossible to maintain. In this world, where industrial progress and urban growth had outpaced the development of sanitation systems and public health infrastructure, women found themselves navigating through miasmas of human and animal waste, industrial pollutants, and the accumulated odors of thousands of people living in close proximity without adequate means of managing the biological consequences of their collective existence. The very air that filled the lungs of women venturing into these urban environments carried with it the evidence of a society that had not yet learned to manage the waste products of its own success, with smoke from countless coal burning stoves and factories mixing with the organic decay of inadequately managed sewage systems and the ever-present reminder of the horses that provided the primary means of transportation and labor in the pre-automotive age. The horses that crowded every street and thoroughfare left behind them a constant stream of manure that accumulated in quantities that modern minds can barely comprehend, with estimates suggesting that a single horse produced between 15 and 30 pounds of manure per day, multiplied by the thousands of horses that were essential to urban life and commerce. This organic matter, combined with the urine and other bodily waste of these animals, created a foundation layer of contamination that influenced every aspect of urban existence, from the mud that splattered onto women's clothing to the dust that filled the air they breathed. The attempts to manage this equine waste were often inadequate and sometimes counterproductive, with street cleaning efforts that simply redistributed the contamination rather than removing it, creating dust clouds of dried manure that could coat clothing and skin with bacterial residue that no amount of perfume or powder could entirely mask. The economic value of horse manure as fertilizer created a complex system of collection and redistribution that meant this waste was constantly being moved through urban areas, ensuring that no neighborhood could escape its influence entirely. The sewage systems that existed in 1880 cities were often primitive and poorly designed, with many areas relying on privy systems and cesspit arrangements that were regularly overwhelmed by the volume of waste they were expected to handle. The overflow from these systems during periods of heavy rain or high usage created temporary rivers of human waste that flowed through streets and alleys, carrying with them not only offensive odors, but dangerous bacteria and disease organisms that could contaminate clothing, shoes, and any other surfaces they contacted. The industrial activities that powered urban economic growth contributed their own unique odors and pollutants to the urban atmosphere, with factories and workshops releasing chemical fumes, particulate matter, and the byproducts of manufacturing processes that were poorly understood and completely unregulated. Women walking through industrial districts might encounter clouds of acidic smoke, metallic dust, or organic vapors that could stain clothing, irritate skin and respiratory systems, and create lasting odors that required extensive efforts to remove the food, preparation, and distribution systems that supplied urban populations created additional sources of contamination and odor, with markets and food vendors operating under conditions that would be considered shocking by modern sanitation standards. The lack of refrigeration meant that food spoilage was a constant presence in urban environments, with the odors of decay and decomposition adding to the complex mixture of scents that characterized city life. The waste disposal practices of the era meant that garbage and refuse of all kinds were often simply thrown into streets or vacant lots, creating accumulations of organic and inorganic waste that attracted vermin and insects, while contributing to the overall degradation of urban air quality. The lack of organized waste collection in many areas meant that residents were left to manage their own refuse disposal, leading to creative but often unsanitary solutions that simply relocated problems rather than solving them. The public transportation systems that were beginning to emerge in larger cities created their own hygiene challenges, With crowded omnibuses and early streetcars becoming enclosed spaces where the accumulated odors and biological emanations of dozens of passengers were concentrated and intensified. Women traveling in these vehicles were exposed to the hygiene failures of strangers while contributing their own imperfectly masked odors to the collective atmosphere, creating social situations that required careful management of personal, space, and breathing patterns. The construction activities that accompanied urban growth and development created clouds of dust and debris that could penetrate clothing and lodge in hair and skin, creating additional challenges for women who were attempting to maintain their appearance while navigating through environments that seemed designed to defeat their efforts. The primitive nature of construction techniques and materials meant that these dust clouds often contained not only particles of stone and wood, but also fragments of organic matter and chemical contaminants that could cause skin irritation and respiratory problems. The boarding houses and hotels that accommodated visitors and temporary residents in urban areas were often overcrowded and inadequately maintained. With shared facilities and limited opportunities for personal hygiene, that meant that even temporary exposure to these environments could result in contamination that was difficult to remove. The close proximity of so many people living under less than ideal conditions created opportunities for the transmission of odors, parasites, and infections that could affect anyone who spent time in these establishments, the markets, and commercial districts where women went to purchase household necessities and luxury items were often located in areas where sanitation was particularly poor, forcing shoppers to navigate through environments where the pursuit of cleanliness and refinement seemed almost hopeless. The combination of animal waste, food spoilage, industrial pollution, and human overcrowding created atmospheric conditions that challenged even the most elaborate systems of personal hygiene and odor management. The seasonal variations in urban odors reflected the changing patterns of economic activity, weather conditions, and biological processes that influence city life throughout the year. Summer heat intensified all odors while promoting the growth of bacteria and the acceleration of decay processes, while winter cold could create different but equally challenging conditions as heating systems reduced ventilation, and the accumulation of organic matter in frozen conditions created their own unique mixtures of contamination. The social dynamics of urban life required women to develop strategies for managing their exposure to these environmental challenges while maintaining the appearance of refinement and cleanliness that their social position demanded. This might involve careful route planning to avoid the worst areas of contamination, strategic timing of outings to minimize exposure during peak pollution periods, or the development of protective clothing and accessories that could be more easily cleaned or replaced after exposure to urban conditions. The economic costs of maintaining personal cleanliness in urban environments were significant, with the need for more frequent clothing changes, specialized cleaning services, and protective accessories adding to the already substantial expenses associated with maintaining a respectable appearance. Families of modest means often found themselves making difficult choices between the financial costs of urban cleanliness and other necessities, while wealthy families could employ servants and specialized services to manage these challenges more effectively. The health consequences of prolonged exposure to urban environmental contamination were poorly understood but increasingly evident, with respiratory problems, skin conditions, and infectious diseases being more common among urban residents than their rural counterparts. The connection between environmental pollution and personal health was only beginning to be understood, leaving women to suffer from conditions that could have been prevented or mitigated through better understanding of the relationship between environmental factors and human well-being. The attempts to create islands of cleanliness and refinement within the urban environment led to the development of exclusive neighborhoods, private clubs, and other spaces where the wealthy could escape from the worst aspects of city life. Yet even these protected environments could not entirely shield their inhabitants from the atmospheric contamination that characterized urban existence during this period. As evening approached and women returned to their homes after days spent navigating through these challenging urban environments, they carried with them not only the visible evidence of their exposure to city conditions, but also the accumulated odors, contaminants, and biological residue that had attached itself to their clothing, hair, and skin throughout their urban adventures. The process of transitioning from public to private space required elaborate rituals of cleaning and changing that were designed to remove as much as possible of the urban contamination they had acquired. Yet the limitations of available cleaning methods meant that much of this contamination remained to become part of the domestic environment. The dreams of these urban women were sometimes troubled by the respiratory irritation and chemical sensitivities that resulted from their daily exposure to city air. Yet they accepted these discomforts as simply part of the price of urban life and modern convenience, rarely making connections between their environmental exposure and their health problems. The legacy of these urban hygiene challenges would eventually contribute to the development of environmental protection laws, urban planning principles, and public health systems that would dramatically improve the quality of urban life. But not before generations of women had learned to adapt to conditions that tested the limits of human tolerance for environmental degradation and contamination. In the gaslight hours that marked the transition from public day to private evening, as these women engaged in their elaborate rituals of decontamination and preparation for the next day's challenges, they represented both the victims of inadequate urban planning and the embodiment of human resilience in the face of environmental conditions that would have defeated less determined spirits. The quiet moments of reflection that punctuated the days of 1880s American women often revealed the profound contradictions that defined their existence, as they moved through a world that demanded the maintenance of impossible standards while providing inadequate means for meeting those demands. In the privacy of their thoughts and the intimacy of their personal relationships, these women grappled with the gap between appearance and reality that characterized every aspect of their hygiene practices, creating internal landscapes of compromise and adaptation that were as complex as they were hidden from public view. The mirror that reflected their carefully constructed appearances each morning also revealed to these women the evidence of their struggles with the basics challenges of cleanliness and health, showing them the skin conditions that powder could only partially conceal, the hair problems that pomades and perfumes could not entirely mask, the dental issues that careful smiling might hide from casual observers, but could not eliminate from their own awareness the internal knowledge that their beauty was largely artificial, that their cleanliness was more illusion than reality, that their refinement was maintained through practices that often compromised their health, created psychological tensions that influenced not only their relationships with themselves but their understanding of what it meant to be feminine in a society that prized appearance over authenticity. The social performances that defined public life required these women to become expert actresses in the drama of refinement, learning to move and speak and interact in ways that would maintain the illusion of effortless elegance while concealing the elaborate systems of concealment and maintenance that made such illusions possible. The energy required to sustain these performances was enormous. Yet the alternative social rejection and economic marginalization made such efforts seem not only worthwhile, but essential to survival. The relationships between women during this period were shaped by shared understanding of these challenges and compromises, creating bonds of solidarity and mutual support that were based not only on common interests, but on common struggles with the impossible demands of feminine hygiene and appearance. The knowledge that all women faced similar challenges created opportunities for empathy and assistance that transcended social class boundaries. Even as the resources available for addressing these challenges varied dramatically based on economic circumstances. The generational transmission of knowledge about hygiene practices created complex relationships between mothers and daughters, as older women passed down not only their techniques and traditions, but also their assumptions and anxieties about cleanliness, health, and feminine responsibility. Young women learned not only how to apply cosmetics and manage their appearance, but also how to navigate the psychological challenges of living with the contradictions between image and reality that define feminine existence. The private conversations that took place between women in the safety of their homes and female social spaces revealed the extent to which hygiene challenges dominated feminine consciousness, with discussions of remedies, techniques, and solutions forming a significant portion of female discourse. These conversations created informal networks of information and support that helped women navigate the complex world of hygiene management while also reinforcing the social expectations that made such management necessary. The economic calculations that influenced hygiene decisions required women to balance the costs of various products and services against their effectiveness and social importance, creating complex decision-making processes that took into account not only immediate needs, but long-term consequences for health, appearance, and social standing. The scarcity of resources that characterized most families' circumstances meant that every choice about hygiene products or practices had implications that extended far beyond the immediate situation. The seasonal rhythms that governed hygiene practices created cycles of challenge and relief that influenced not only daily routines, but psychological well-being, as women learned to anticipate and prepare for the increased difficulties that certain times of year would bring, while also looking forward to periods when their hygiene challenges might be somewhat reduced. The cultural influences that shaped hygiene practices reflected the complex mixture of traditions and innovations that characterized American society during this period, with immigrant communities bringing their own approaches to cleanliness and health while adapting to American conditions and expectations. The resulting hybrid practices often combined elements from multiple cultural traditions in ways that created new solutions to old problems, while sometimes creating new problems that required additional adaptation. The religious and moral dimensions of hygiene practices created additional layers of meaning and significance for women who understood cleanliness not only as a practical necessity, but as a moral obligation and spiritual practice. The connection between physical cleanliness and moral purity that characterized much of 1880s American culture meant that hygiene failures were often interpreted as moral failures, creating additional pressure and anxiety around practices that were already challenging enough from a purely practical standpoint. The medical understanding that influenced hygiene practices was still evolving during this period, with theories about health and disease that would later be proven incorrect, creating confusion and misdirection in women's efforts to maintain their health and cleanliness. The trust that women placed in medical authorities and commercial claims often led them to adopt practices that were ineffective or harmful, while their own experiential knowledge was sometimes dismissed or undervalued. Despite its practical relevance, the technological limitations that constrained hygiene practices created frustrations and disappointments for women who understood what needed to be accomplished but lacked the tools and resources necessary to achieve their goals effectively. The promise of industrial progress and scientific advancement that characterized the era created expectations that were often not met by the actual products and services available to ordinary consumers. The social mobility aspirations that motivated many hygiene practices reflected the belief that proper Appearance and cleanliness could contribute to improved social and economic circumstances, creating investments in hygiene products and practices that families could barely afford in the hope that such investments would pay dividends. In terms of marriage prospects, social acceptance, and economic opportunities. The environmental challenges that influenced hygiene practices created additional complexity for women who were attempting to maintain cleanliness and health, while living in conditions that seemed designed to defeat such efforts. The pollution, contamination, and unsanitary conditions that characterized much of urban and industrial America during this period meant that even the most dedicated to kiddy efforts to maintain hygiene were constantly undermined by external factors beyond individual control. The international influences that shaped American hygiene practices reflected the country's complex relationship with European traditions and innovations, with American women often looking to European examples for guidance and inspiration while also developing distinctly American approaches to the challenges they faced. The importation of European products and practices sometimes provided solutions to American problems while sometimes creating new problems that required local adaptation. As the sun set on each day in 1880s America, as women across the country engaged in their evening rituals of cleaning and preparation, they participated in a collective struggle with the fundamental challenges of human existence in a society that had not yet learned to balance its aspirations for refinement and progress with the practical requirements of health and cleanliness. The legacy of their efforts, their compromises, and their creative adaptations would eventually contribute to significant improvements in hygiene practices, public health systems, and social understanding of the relationship between cleanliness and health. But not before their own generation had paid the price of pioneering these developments through their personal sacrifices and struggles. In the quiet darkness that settled over American homes each night, these women carried with them not only the physical evidence of their daily battles with hygiene challenges, but also the knowledge that they had done their best within the constraints they faced, that they had maintained their dignity and their commitment to feminine ideals despite the impossible circumstances that made such maintenance so difficult and costly. Their dreams, when they finally came, often reflected the tensions and contradictions that defined their waking lives, creating nocturnal landscapes where the pursuit of cleanliness and beauty continued even in sleep, where the anxieties and aspirations that shaped their daily routines found expression in symbolic forms that revealed the profound psychological impact of living with such fundamental contradictions between appearance and reality. As the hours passed and morning approached once again, these sleeping women prepared to wake to another day of managing the impossible demands of feminine hygiene in 1880s
America.
Their rest providing only temporary relief from challenges that would resume with the first light of dawn and continue until the next evening, brought another opportunity for brief respite from the endless cycle of concealment, maintenance, and performance that defined their existence. The gentle closing of our journey through the hidden chambers of 1880s American feminine life brings us to a moment of quiet contemplation, where the gaslight dims and the secrets we have shared together settle into the peaceful shadows of understanding. As we have walked together through these intimate landscapes of powder and perfume, of desperate cleanliness and dangerous beauty, we have discovered truths that history has largely forgotten, stories that were lived in whispers and endured in silence, by women whose struggles with the most basic aspects of human hygiene reveal the profound complexities of their time. In the fading light of our exploration, we can see these women not as curiosities from a distant past, but as pioneers who navigated impossible circumstances with grace and determination, who found ways to create beauty and maintain dignity within systems that offered them few good choices and fewer resources for addressing their most fundamental needs. Their daily battles with cleanliness and health were not failures of character or intelligence, but rational responses to a world that demanded perfection while providing only imperfect tools for achieving it. The elaborate systems of concealment and maintenance that we have examined together, the waterless washing, the toxic cosmetics, the shared beds, and contaminated accessories represent not the quaint customs of a bygone era, but the creative adaptations of women who refuse to surrender their aspirations for beauty and refinement despite the obstacles that their society placed in their path. Their willingness to endure discomfort, to accept risk, to invest enormous amounts of time and energy in the pursuit of cleanliness that was more appearance than reality, speaks not to vanity or foolishness, but to the strength and resilience that enabled them to survive and even thrive within impossible constraints. The legacy of their struggles extends far beyond their own lifetimes, influencing the development of modern hygiene practices, cosmetic safety regulations, public health systems, and social understanding of the relationship between cleanliness and health in ways that continue to benefit us today. The improvements in sanitation, the advances in medical knowledge, the consumer protection laws that we now take for granted all grew from the soil of their experiences, watered by their suffering and nurtured by their determination to create better conditions for the generations that would follow. Yet perhaps the most profound legacy of these 1880s women lies not in the specific practices they developed or the problems they solved, but in their demonstration of human adaptability and creativity in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges. Their ability to find beauty and meaning within the constraints of their circumstances, to maintain hope and dignity despite the daily evidence of their own limitations, to pass on to their daughters not only their techniques and traditions, but also their determination to seek better solutions, represents the best of human nature responding to the worst of human circumstances, as we allow ourselves to drift away from more a world and back toward our own. We carry with us not only the knowledge of their specific struggles, but an deeper appreciation for the complexity of human experience and the profound courage required to navigate the basic challenges of existence with grace and determination. Their hidden histories remind us that every generation faces its own impossible circumstances, its own contradictions between aspiration and reality, its own need to find creative solutions to problems that seem to have no good answers. The perfumed illusions that characterized their daily lives were not simply deceptions, but survival strategies that enabled them to participate in a society that offered them limited alternatives while maintaining their sense of personal worth and feminine identity. The gap between appearance and reality that defined their existence was not a failure of honesty, but a necessary adaptation to social systems that prioritized image over substance while providing inadequate support for achieving either successfully in the deepest quiet of night. As we complete our journey together through these forgotten chapters of American women's lives, we can honor their memory not through judgment or condescension, but through recognition of their humanity and appreciation for their contributions to the ongoing human project of learning to balance aspiration with reality, beauty with health, individual needs with social expectations. Their dreams, as they lay in their shared beds surrounded by the evidence of their daily struggles with cleanliness and health, were not so different from our own hopes for comfort and acceptance, longings for beauty and love, desires for lives that would be meaningful and worthwhile despite the limitations and challenges that defined their circumstances. Their commitment to these dreams, maintained despite the obvious difficulties they faced in pursuing them, represents a kind of courage that transcends the specific conditions of their time and speaks to universal human aspirations for dignity and grace. The morning light that would greet them after our Story ends would bring another day of the same challenges and compromises that we have examined together. Another opportunity to practice the arts of concealment and presentation that defined their approach to feminine hygiene and social participation. Yet each new day also brought possibilities for small improvements, minor innovations, and incremental progress toward the better solutions that their daughters and granddaughters would eventually inherit. The scent of their world, that complex mixture of rosewater and perspiration, lavender sachets and accumulated odors, expensive perfumes and biological reality fades now as we return to our own time. Yet it leaves behind a lingering awareness of the profound challenges that previous generations faced and overcame in their journey toward the more comfortable and healthy lives that we now enjoy as sleep approaches and our shared exploration draws to its gentle close. We can carry with us not only the specific knowledge we have gained about hygiene practices in 1880s America, but also a deeper understanding of the courage and creativity that human beings bring to their daily struggles with the basic requirements of existence. These women, in their quiet determination to maintain beauty and dignity despite impossible circumstances, have left us a legacy that extends far beyond the realm of hygiene and health to encompass the fundamental questions of how we choose to live when faced with constraints that seem to make our aspirations impossible. Let their stories dissolve now into the peaceful darkness of sleep, their struggles transformed into dreams, their hidden histories integrated into our understanding of the complex tapestry of human experience that connects us across the centuries. In honoring their memory through our attention to their stories, we acknowledge not only their specific contributions to the development of modern hygiene practices, but their broader participation in the ongoing human effort to create lives of meaning and beauty within the constraints that define every historical moment. The gaslight flickers one final time and goes dark. The curtains settle into stillness, and the hidden world of 1880s American feminine hygiene fades into the peaceful embrace of historical memory, leaving us with gratitude for the opportunity to walk briefly in their footsteps and appreciation for the courage and creativity that enabled them to navigate the complex challenges of their time with such remarkable grace and determination. Sleep well, dear listener, and may your dreams be filled with the gentle spirits of these remarkable women, whose hidden struggles and quiet triumphs have enriched our understanding of the past while inspiring us to face our own challenges with similar courage and creativity. The story ends, but the legacy continues, flowing like a quiet river through the landscape of human experience, carrying forward the lessons learned and the wisdom gained through generations of women who refused to surrender their dreams despite the obstacles that stood in their way.